So what did we gain out of the Texas Revolution?
That there's a lot of drinking.
Well, that was what Bowie was known for, but that's what we gained from it. What did we gain from that? Texas, they got their independence, right? Okay. Then, the Mexican War. What did we learn from the Mexican War last week? Because we signed the treaty with Mexico that the Mexicans never looked at the treaty as legit. So they still believe they owned a lot of the land and they weren't supposed to cross the Rio Grande, which they did, which caused a conflict. Now, who was the two U.S. generals that was famous? One became a president and the other one tried to run as the president.
Zachary Taylor.
Okay, that's one. And who's the other one?
James Madison.
Nope, that was 1812.
Winfield Scott.
Winfield Scott. All right, so they went down there and fought. Who was some of the famous people that fought in the Mexican War that were brand new out of West Point? And you're going to hear about them in the Civil War. And I told you to remember these names.
Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Ulysses S. Grant.
Very good. All right. So the Mexican War happens. Who comes from the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico actually? Who comes from Puerto Rico and goes back to Mexico to become the president and the general? And he was in the Texas Revolution too. Yeah, Santa Anna. So what happens after the Mexican War, after we defeated them at Chihuahua and Montgomery and all the major battles in the Mexican War, what happens? What do the United States gain out of it? Yeah.
I don't know.
More territory, right? We just won the war. So now we've got New Mexico, Santa Fe area, California. So now we are moving further west. Now we're getting into, I was telling you a little bit about the 1849 gold rush. We're going out there, standardizing the colonies out there, for them to become states. But now the issue of slavery is going to come up in the 1850s. And there are going to be a lot of fighting between the people now, not just much as the government. The people are going to start fighting each other. Which way are they going to present themselves? Are they going to say, is this state going to be free of no slaves, or is this state going to be a slave state?
Ladies and gentlemen, please rise. President of the United States.
Today we have a special guest. We have the senator, or the congressman, sorry, all right, from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. He will be running in the 1860 election, and he brought his guards to guard him, and he will be talking about the difficulties this country came through from the 1850s to the beginning of the Civil War. So right now I will turn it over to the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. You may be seated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, we have a diverse group here. Looks like anywhere from young to somewhat older, maybe, I should say, somewhat. So how many of you are teachers here? Teachers here, one, and two. Parents, how many are parents? Parents, okay, parents, very good, good. Well, I'm going to start out by asking you something that happened way before 1850, which I'll get to in a few minutes. How many know what happened in 1607? Way back, way before 1850. You know what?
When we got to North America.
Okay, Jamestown. First settlement, Jamestown. Then, the reason why I bring this up is that 12 years after that, about 1619, in Jamestown, they brought over about 24 slaves. 24. From those 24 to about 4 million in 1860. This was causing a problem. Nobody back then in 1607, 1619, when they came over, they didn't know that we would have a United States of America. They didn't know we'd have a Revolutionary War. They didn't know that their mother country then, England, would be in a war with the colonies. They didn't know we'd have 13 colonies at that time. They didn't know any of that. They didn't know that those 24 slaves back there would grow to almost 4 million by 1850, 1860. So they did not know anything about the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, all those founding fathers. They didn't know anything like that. That's 200 years ahead of their time. How many of you today can predict 200 years from now what's going to happen? Anybody want to give an idea? Have you ever thought about that? What's the world going to be like in 200 years? They didn't know it was going to be like it was in 1850, 1860. So those slaves back then became the crux of the problem over 200 years later. In 1800, probably had close to 1 million in 1800. And then it began to grow and grow and grow until we had about 4 million by 1860. And one of the causes of that, perhaps, was the invention of the cotton gin, which could replace maybe 15, 20, or 24 slaves taking the seeds out of the cotton. Cotton had become a big crop in the South because the climate was good there, it was warm, and cotton could be produced and grown in great quantities. But then you have to take the seeds out of that to sell it. You can't sell it with seeds in there, so you have to take the seeds out, and at that time the slaves would do that. So when this machine came along, it would replace maybe 15, 20, or maybe 24 slaves, and then those slaves then could go out in the field and grow more cotton. Grow more cotton, and then there became a market for it over in Europe and England, and some of it sold in the north too of our country. And that market began to grow and grow, and slavery began to grow, and pretty soon they called it cash cotton, king cotton. There were probably more wealthy people in the South and selling cotton than in the North, percentage-wise. So cotton became a big crop, and the slaves were there to grow the cotton. They became very, very important. So the idea that in the beginning that these people were referred to as people, the slaves were referred to as people, in the Constitution it said 3/5, we would count them as 3/5 of a person. 3/5 of a person. Then as time went by, there came into the vocabulary of the South the idea that they were property. Property that could be taken anywhere in the country and be used as slaves. They became property for the Southern people. And so we had this division between the North and the South. Most of the slaves were in the South. Many states in the North were, over a period of time, they would free what slaves they had. But as I said, the climate, the soil, the weather conditions were conducive to growing cotton in the South. Not in the North, but in the South is where it was profitable to grow cotton. So that industry, that agricultural crop began to grow and grow and grow. And so we had this divide in our country between those who said, well, we think slavery is wrong, and those who said, well, no, it's just okay. These people, many of them thought, these people are inferior to us, and so the white race can use them any way we want because they really couldn't take care of themselves anyway. And so we have to tell them what to do, show them what to do. We give them food, we give them some shelter, and they work for us. If we free them, they would know what to do because they're not quite as smart as we are, not as intelligent. They're different people. That was some of the view. That was one of the views of some of the people in the South. And so they began to fight back verbally against the northern people who called themselves abolitionists. They wanted to abolish slavery. They thought it was morally wrong that one group of people subjugate or make another group slaves. They thought that was wrong. In the South, they thought that was okay. So we have this division growing in our country over slavery. How far should we let it go? Should it expand to other areas of our country and just keep growing and growing and growing? Every now and then we have this argument, debate, fight over slavery. So we have the Missouri Compromise, which tried to compromise the country and keep one part of it slave, one part of it free. Missouri Compromise, the boundary line of Missouri. Missouri came in as a slave state and Maine as a free state. And the boundary line between the division between the country, slave and anti-slave, was the southern boundary of Missouri, 36 degrees 30 minutes. So that line would be extended across the country, and above that line, except for Missouri, you couldn't have slaves. South of that line, all those other states south could have slaves anywhere they wanted. And so that held up for a while, and we tried to balance it out with, when one slave state would come in, then we'd have a free state to come in. We tried to keep it balanced, and for a long time, we kept it balanced. And then in 1850, we had the imbalance, because when California became a state in 1850, then the balance was lost, became imbalanced, and California became the 16th, and the that was a free state, and the slave states were 15. So we have an imbalance here now. So in order to make the compromise go, we did throw in, our government did throw in the idea of fugitive slave law, which said that if a slave would get away and go to the north, then it's the responsibility of the northern authorities, like the police or the sheriff or whoever might be there, it's their responsibility to send that slave back. Send the slave back to where he or she came from. Most of them were he's. To send it back. So that was kind of a compromise there. Now you know what a compromise is, don't you? One side gets a little bit, the other side gets a little bit. Neither side gets all they want, but they have to compromise for the good of both of them. And so that was another compromise that we worked out to try to prevent this argument, this debate, or, heaven forbid, secession. But it is separation. That might have been in the views of a few people there in 1850 that maybe we might be approaching that, but nobody really talked about that a whole lot. But if you look ahead, then it becomes more and more prevalent. 1850, then 1850s became the decade of almost division. We began to go toward dividing our country into two parts and having a civil war. So some of the events that happened in 1850s. Well, there was a book written called Uncle Tom's Cabin. You may have heard of that. And in that book, it showed, or presumably showed, how the slaves were treated in the South very poorly, badly. And so this upset a lot of people in the North, and they were saying, look, here's the way they're treated down there. They're whipped, they're beaten, they're not treated very well, maybe hanged. If they misbehave. And so it antagonized a lot of people in the North. And in the South, they said, oh, this is a bunch of lies. I said, this is not the way it is. You know, it might happen a few times, but we're treating them okay. So we have that added to this debate now between the North and the South. One side says, that's the way it is. The other side said, no, those are all lies, not true, not true. Then in 1854, we had the Kansas-Nebraska Act. A debate over how far slavery should go in our country. Should it be allowed to go anywhere in the West, anywhere in the new territories or new states in the West that might be brought into the Union? And so the Kansas-Nebraska Act, headed by a man named Senator Douglas, said that, passed by Congress in 1854, said that we would have popular sovereignty out there. Oh, popular sovereignty. If the people want slavery, and they vote for it, that's okay. It's what the people want, that's what we're going to give them, popular sovereignty. Senator Douglas says that's the only way to do it. That's a democratic way to do it. Vote on whether you want slavery or not. My view was, you mean you vote? You actually vote to make somebody a slave? You vote to make somebody work in the fields as a slave? I said, this is not right. So it destroyed the Missouri Compromise. Before, the Missouri Compromise had the line that said north, no slaves, south, you could have. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska comes along and says, well, you can have them anywhere if the people vote for it. Let them vote on it. That's the democratic way to do it. That's what Senator Douglas said. I said, no, that's just not right. I didn't like that decision, but that was the law. That's the way it happened. Then, shortly after that, we had the bleeding of Kansas and Nebraska. The anti-slavery and the slavery people out there were in a mini civil war. They were fighting one another out there over the issue of slavery, trying to get control of the government so that they could pass or not pass slavery laws. So they were fighting for the control of the territories, and they were fighting out there and killing one another. There was a man out there named John Brown who was involved in a lot of shootings and killings, and they were just, it was a civil war, a mini civil war, a prelude to the real one that would come a few years later. But they were fighting it. Slavery and anti-slavery people were fighting that war out there to try to get control of those territories and states so that they would come into the Union either slave or anti-slave or no slavery. So that was a result of that Kansas-Nebraska Act. We had that mini civil war out there where many people were being killed. Then that went on for a year or two or three. In 1855, we selected a Republican nominee for the president. The first nominee by the Republican Party. A new party in America called the Republican Party was being formed, and in 1855 they selected John C. Fremont as their candidate for 1856. Their main platform was that we cannot extend slavery beyond where it is now. We can't allow it to go on and on and on and on. We can't do much about it where it is right now. If we keep it contained there, that's about all we can do. We can't abolish slavery. There's nothing in the Constitution that says we can do that. But if we can prevent it from being spread all over the country, then that might be a good thing. Then it might just gradually die out. So that was our main platform. John C. Fremont ran for the Republican, and Mr. Buchanan ran for the Democrat, and he won the election. Buchanan won the election and would become president until I came in 1861. So that was going on. Presidential campaigns going on. Still the big issue in the campaign, slavery. What do we do with it? This is causing a turmoil in our country that our founding fathers did not realize was going to happen. See, they couldn't look down the road 50 or 60 or 80 years. They couldn't do that and see what's going to happen. Just like those people in Jamestown couldn't look 200 years into the future and tell what's going to happen. Our founding fathers could not envision that we would have this great divide on and on and on and on. They didn't realize that, but it was happening. It was going on. Then 1857, Dred Scott decision, Supreme Court. There's a slave named Dred Scott, who was taken by his owner into free territory. I think it was Minnesota, free territory. Kept him there for a year or so, worked up there. He was helping somebody up there, and the slave worked up there under the guise of the owner. And then he brought him back to Missouri, where he had been before, into a slave state. And some of the people got a hold of that idea, the lawyers and so forth, the family. Actually, I think the owner actually died, and then somebody else got control of Dred Scott. That was his name, Dred Scott. And they sued for his freedom. They said, look, he was in free territory for a long time. He should be free. Shouldn't be a slave anymore, should be free. Finally, it made it through the court system all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1857, the Supreme Court said, basically, slaves have no rights at all. Black people have no rights at all. They're slaves. They have no rights. They can't even sue in a court. They shouldn't be here. They have no rights. They have no inalienable rights that we said in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Inalienable means rights you can't take away. They don't have any of those rights. They're just property. You can take them anywhere you want, and they're still slaves. Oh, that upset a lot of people. They're not citizens of the country. That upset me. That upset a lot of people, that they were going to be called non-citizens, no rights whatsoever. That's what the Supreme Court said. Well, that upset me, as I said, a lot of other people, and that added to the argument. You know, here's the bitterness is continuing to grow. The argument is continuing to grow, and on and on and on. And then in 1858, I ran for the senator's position in Illinois against Senator Douglas, the same man who put the Kansas Nebraska Act together. Senator Douglas, the one who said, well, if the people want slavery, let them vote for it. That's the democratic way to do it. Popular sovereignty. Well, we debated the issue, and I think at the beginning of that campaign I said something like, a house divided against itself cannot stand. A government half slave and half free cannot stand. I don't think we'll have a war. I think the Union will not be dissolved, but it's going to become one or the other. It's either going to become all slave or all free. We can't continue on this path where every few years we have this big debate, this big argument, this big fight over, well, can we have slavery or not? Does that state a slave state or a free state? We can't continue to do that and be a united country. We can't do that. It's going to come down. It's either going to be one or the other, all slave or all free. Now, I wasn't predicting a war. I didn't know that we would have a civil war in 2 or 3 more years. I wasn't predicting that, but I thought it would go one way or the other. We cannot continue with our government, our country, our house divided against itself. It's like a family. You know, the mother goes one way and her ideas, the father goes another way, and if you don't work it out together, then pretty soon, what happens? You're not together. So our country's headed sort of in that direction. If we don't get this straightened out, bad things are happening pretty soon. Well, actually, Senator Douglas beat me in that election in 1858. He convinced enough people that popular sovereignty was okay and was all right to do. And he won the election. Then in 1859, another event that really exacerbated or caused this argument to get more heated, John Brown, the guy out in Kansas, Nebraska, who had been fighting against slavery. He was actually a strong abolitionist, and he would kill anybody he thought might be a slave owner or connected with a slave, with a slave person. He decided that he was going to cause a slave uprising. So he went to Harper's Ferry with some of his sons and some other men, and they were going to attack Harper's Ferry, which was a federal arsenal, get guns and ammunition and give them to the slaves in the South and cause a slave uprising. And free the slaves. Free the slaves. Well, grandiose idea, big idea, but it didn't work out. He was caught. The man who headed the group of military personnel, a regiment or a group that captured him, his name was Robert E. Lee. You ever heard of him? Robert E. Lee? A Union Army officer captured John Brown, brought to trial, charged with treason for attacking a federal arsenal, federal property. Treason. And hanged. He was hanged because of that. Well, many in the South said, well, look what you Republicans are doing. You caused him to do that. You put him up to that. We said, no, we didn't do that. He did that on his own accord. We didn't tell him to do that. He just decided that's what he wanted to do. He actually said this. He said the only way to wipe the scourge of this country away, to get rid of it, is by blood. He was talking about slavery. The only way to get rid of slavery is with blood. Blood to cleanse the nation of this great foul entity. You know what? He might have been right. Because in about 1.5 years or so, we had a civil war. And what happened? A lot of blood was spilled. At the end of the war, slavery was abolished. Maybe he did some bad things, but maybe he predicted the future. The only way to wipe this scourge off our country is with blood. Excuse me. Cleanse it with blood. And we had a civil war, which finally, eventually did abolish slavery, but with a lot of bloodshed. A lot of bloodshed. Now, 1860, I was nominated as the next Republican candidate for the presidency. I, Abraham Lincoln. Born in a log cabin with a dirt floor, with uneducated parents, with no high school diploma, no college education, but I had been a lawyer. I had been involved in politics for a while. I was nominated to be the Republican candidate for president in 1860. I thought, wow, this, in America, that I can come from a log cabin with hardly any early education, and I'm going to be nominated to be President of the United States of America. Now, I hadn't been elected yet. That would come later. But at least I was nominated. A couple of other guys that were running, Mr. Seward and Mr. Chase, were running. One, Seward from New York and Chase from Ohio. And I beat them out on about the third ballot there. I think it was very close between Mr. Seward and me. And 3 or 4 people from the Ohio delegation switched from Chase to me and put me over the top. I was going to be the nominee. So here I am, the nominee. Now, between that summer of 1860 and the election in November, I received a letter from a little girl named Grace Bedell, lived in Westfield, New York. See, I didn't have a beard then. I wasn't born with a beard. Did you realize that? I was not born with a beard. I've never seen anybody born with a beard. If they were, they'd probably be in the circus, wouldn't they? Usually grow it later. Well, I didn't have a beard. Well, I had one, but I shaved it off. That's what my wife Mary wanted me to do, shave the beard off. She didn't like that stubble. But anyway, the little girl wrote me a letter, and she said, you notice I have some things in my hat. I have a lot of notes in here. Let's see. I didn't carry a briefcase, and I couldn't remember it all, so I put it in my hat. Some people keep things in their head. I keep things in my hat. Anyway, I'll tell you what the little girl said. She says, Honorable A.B. Lincoln, capital A, capital B. My father brought a picture of you home from the county fair the other day, and I noticed you did not have a beard, and I think maybe you might consider growing a beard. Your face is so thin, the beard might fill it out. I think she was telling me it wasn't very good looking, maybe the beard might help a little bit. And then she said, if you grow the beard, the men will vote for you. Because they like other men with beards. It makes you look more intelligent, more presidential. Grow the beard, and I think you'll be president. She didn't say anything about women, though. Why wouldn't the women vote for me? Probably not good looking enough, maybe. Why wouldn't the women vote for me? Oh my gracious! Oh, can you believe a world where women don't have the right to vote? You're not old enough to vote, though, are you? But when you are, you can vote. What if they said, because you're a lady, a woman, you can't vote? Would you be upset? You would be, wouldn't you? Well, my wife Mary was too, but that's the way it was back then. Mary couldn't even vote for me. Anyway, the little girl said, I think you should consider growing the beard, and I think it may help you to become president. People will vote for you. So I took the letter home to my wife Mary, and I said, what do you think, Mary? You think I ought to grow the beard? Mary studied for a while. She said, you know, I hadn't thought about that, but that might be a good idea. Hey, you should grow the beard. Of course, Mary had always wanted to be in the White House. Even when she was a little girl, about your age is right here, she's told people she wanted to marry a man who'd be president. She was thinking about the White House and the dances and the dinners and the gala occasions and so forth. She said, Mr. Lincoln, I think you might consider grow the beard. So I began to grow the beard. This is probably in October. The election in November. And I wrote the little girl back, Grace Bedell, Westfield, New York, and she asked about my family. I said I didn't have any little girls, we had all boys. And then I began to grow the beard, and on November the 7th, I went down to the telegraph office in Springfield, Illinois, where we were living at that time, and watched the results come in from the election. I had a skimpy, scant beard at that time, not like that, but it was coming in. You could tell it was growing right there. November the 7th, about 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock the next morning. I was watching the telegraph operator and listening to him and watching him write on this pad, and I would hear the click, 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 and he knew what all that meant. I didn't, but he did. He was writing it down. Abraham Lincoln has been elected the 16th President of the United States of America. I read that on that little piece of paper he wrote down. I was going to be president. I, Abraham Lincoln, born in that one-room, dirt floor cabin, no college. I was going to be president. Oh, it just hit me like, oh wow, now what do I do? Well, when I read that, I felt like I was about 10 or 15 pounds heavier. I went home and told my wife, Mary, and she felt 10 pounds lighter. What's the difference? I felt heavier and she felt lighter. You know, because you're smiling. You know why.
Because of the responsibility you have.
I was going to have the responsibility, and Mary was thinking about the parties, the dinners, and all that. There's kind of fun things in the White House. But I was hearing this word being thrown around. I mentioned it once before. Secession. Oh, there were people in the South saying, oh, that Lincoln fellow, if he's elected, we might consider leaving the Union, seceding from the Union, because we think he's going to be a tyrant, a dictator, throw away the Constitution, and he might just come down here and abolish slavery. Oh, wouldn't that be terrible? We don't like him. We don't like it. Matter of fact, nobody voted for me in the South. Most places my name was not even on the ballot. So I did not win the South, but I did win enough in the North to win the election. There were three other guys running, Senator Douglas, Mr. Bell, and Breckinridge were running. And I won the election basically on in the Electoral College. You know, there are two ways that actually the main way is the electoral vote. Maybe you studied that, maybe you haven't. But if you get enough electoral votes, and if you get big states, if you win a big state, then you get all those votes that are tabulated. Anyway, I won the election. I was going to be the next president. So then, all this talk between November the 7th or 6th and March the 4th the next year, a lot of things were going on. There were people in Congress trying to avert this war, this civil war that many of them thought was coming. The talk got more vociferous, louder, stronger, bitter, and that word secession was being thrown around. We may secede from the Union. And they worked on a couple of compromises. There was one called the Crittenden Compromise, which would have gone back to the original Missouri Compromise of 1820, where they divided the country into the non-slave and slave sections of the country. Remember talking about that? And that didn't get passed. And then, actually, they came up with a 13th Amendment. There are two 13th Amendments in our history. This is the first one. It said that the federal government could not, in the future, ever abolish slavery. Federal government could not put into the Constitution an amendment to abolish slavery. If it was to be done, it had to be done by the states. They would have to do it individually. But the federal government could not do this. I said that's the first one. There was another one in 1865 that was exactly the opposite. Have you studied about that one? 1865? How many know what I'm talking about? 1865, 13th Amendment? Yeah, one or two of you here. Okay. Anyway, that first 13th Amendment said the federal government cannot abolish slavery in any state where it exists. Cannot do that. It passed Congress, but it failed to go to the states to be approved by 3/4 of the states because the war started. And that just wiped out the whole process. The war started April the 12th, 1861. The war started. Now, before that time, I had to give my inaugural address on March the 4th there in Washington. Let me just read to you a couple paragraphs that I put at the end of this address. And I was directing this mainly to the southern states who were saying, we're going to be leaving the Union. By the way, on the way to Washington, I let this out, but let me go back and pick it up. I'd met the little girl who wrote me the letter and said, grow the beard. Grace Bedell, Westfield, New York. We met her, Mary and I and our two boys, met her in Westfield, New York. I had a delightful conversation with her. Actually, I talked and she listened mostly. Because if you're 12 years old, you're not going to talk to a future president very much, are you? How old are you?
12.
Would you talk to a future president a whole lot? You'd probably just listen, wouldn't you? You stand there, well, that's what she did. Cute little girl. About your size, brown hair, I think. She'd written a letter a few months earlier and told me if I grew the beard, it might help me become president. And here I am, on the way to being president. And we had to stop and talk with her, and we did. And then on to Washington. And by the way, on the way to Washington, about February 18th, in the South, the state representatives, the state houses, states, the Congresses are representatives in the states, selected a man to be the president of the Confederacy. They were serious about this. What was his name? Anybody know?
Jefferson Davis.
Give him an A. Is this teacher here today?
Yeah.
What's your name?
Jonathan.
Good job, Jonathan. Jefferson Davis, exactly. Jeff Davis was selected. I say selected, not elected, but selected to be the president of the Confederate States of America. They were serious. They were going to separate. They were going to call themselves by another name. Wow, they are serious. Now, what am I going to do about that? Well, in my inaugural address on March the 4th, I had to address that, talking about our country. And in that address, I said, I may need my glasses on this, folks. Let me dig down here and get my glasses so I think I may have had them on at that time, too. The last two paragraphs, I said, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government. Well, I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am reluctant to close. We are not enemies. We are friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the course of the Union when again touched as surely they will be by the better angels of our nature. I was appealing to them. Don't do this. Think about this now. We all came from the same background, the same foundation, the same founding fathers, the same Declaration of Independence, the same Constitution. We should not be fighting one another. We shouldn't be enemies. We should be friends and try to work this problem out. But that didn't work, and as I think I mentioned already, on April the 12th, 1861, South Carolina militia attacked Fort Sumter, a federal fort in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. And that began 4 years of bloody war. Maybe John Brown was right. The only way to clean this scourge of our country is with blood. And it took 620,000 plus men who were killed in that war, and gallons of blood spilled on the battlefields around America. But by 1865, January 31st, we passed the second 13th Amendment, which said, no more slavery in America. Anywhere, at any time, there will be no more slavery in America. And the war ended. Now, maybe I should stop here and see what direction we want to go, or for questions, maybe.
You can ask questions if you like.
Questions, yes. All right, anybody have any questions? I'm sure I didn't explain everything. Question, yes. Yes, over here.
Would you give a little bit of your Gettysburg Address?
407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent. Is that enough? That's a little bit. That's a little bit, isn't it? Well, that came later on, though.
Right.
That was in the middle of the war. After about 2 years of fighting, then a little town in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, there was this great, terrible battle between the Union and the Confederate forces, and under General Meade, the Union was victorious. Sent Robert E. Lee back down below the Potomac, and never really threatened the northern part of the country again after that. Now, why was he up there? First of all, a little background on that. He and Jefferson Davis and the military decided that if they could go north and if they could capture a city in the north, a big city, maybe even attack Pittsburgh or Albany or New York, well, that'd really be something, and scare the northern people, maybe they might send a message to me and to Congress to quit the war. We'll support it while it's down there, but we're not going to support it up here in our backyard. That was their idea. So if they can go up there and scare the people in the north into saying, President, just let him go, let him take slavery and go with it, then they might succeed. Also, if they are impressive in the north against the Union Army, then maybe England might come in on their side. England had been kind of wavering back and forth, do we come in on the side of the north or the south, or what should we do? And because of the cotton, they might have a reason to come in for the south if they thought they were going to win. You don't want to jump into a war that you don't think can be won. You don't want to be on the losing side. So if the South can impress them over there that they're going to win this war, then England might start sending help over here. Some money, maybe a few troops or something like that. And that was the reason why they were going up there. But then they met there at that little town of Gettysburg, which wasn't anything like New York or Pittsburgh. They happened to meet accidentally. There they are. They didn't know really where each army was, and there they are. They met one day, and well, what do armies do when they meet on the battlefield? What do? Do they shake hands and say, how are you today? How are things going?
Die.
No, they start fighting, don't they? That's their object out there, is to fight. It's like two big dogs that meet out in the pasture. They fight one another. They just fight. So they had this big battle for 3 days. And finally, at the end of the third day, July the 3rd, General Meade repulsed a charge up Cemetery Ridge and pushed him back down. And Lee told his men and said, we're going up that ridge, that hillside there. We're going to take that Union Army up there. And he sent about 15,000 men up there to do that. And they didn't do it. They were almost, half of them were either killed or wounded. They were slaughtered, just wiped out. They came back down the hill, the ridge, and Lee could be heard saying, it's all my fault. This is all my fault. I shouldn't have done that. It's my fault. Probably said it 5 or 6 times. It's my fault. I shouldn't have done that. My fault. See, he'd been victorious in most of the other battles, even when he was outmanned, didn't have as many troops as the other generals, and he would finagle, trick, and do all kinds of tricky things on the battlefield, and he was winning. I think he got to the point where he thought, I'm invincible. Whatever I do is going to work. So he thought, this will work, but it didn't work for him. It backfired. The Union Army had won. General Lee that night and the next morning on July the 4th took his men and headed back down to the Potomac River, across the Potomac, and never again to really have a real danger to the northern cities or northern states. So the Gettysburg then was and on the same day, Vicksburg, Mississippi, General Grant won a battle out there after he'd besieged that fort for several months, and the Confederates surrendered there. So 2 big battles on July the 4th. Oh, I was ecstatic. I thought, wow, July the 4th and July the 4th? What happened on July the 4th? A long time ago. What happened on July?
The Declaration of Independence.
Oh, the Declaration of Independence. I thought, is this a good omen? July the 4th. Well, the war wasn't going to be over. We're still going another almost 2 years. But anyway, I was sent a letter sometime after that and asked to go to Gettysburg to say a few appropriate words at the dedication of the National Soldier Cemetery as president. A few appropriate words. The man in front of me, Edward Everett, was going to give the keynote speech. And we arrived there on about the 17th and then went out to the battlefield on the 18th. And I sat there. I probably had my speech in my pocket here. Listened to that man speak for 2 hours. Oh, but he was good. He had them in tears, telling about the bravery and the courage who fought there, and they were just enamored. And they were, they were just crying because they'd had maybe a father or son or relative or friend in that battle most of their lives. I sat there nervous because I thought, wow, this guy's good. And he was a great orator of the day. I thought, he is really good. I kept thinking, mine might go 2.5 minutes. How does that compare with an hour? Well, I couldn't change it. I couldn't go rewrite it and make it longer. So, when I was announced, introduced, and they said, the speaker says, and now, ladies and gentlemen, a few words from the President of the United States of America. Then I walked up to the podium and looked out. I guess I can stand up on this, can't I? Looked out at that, probably about 15,000 people out there today, from all over the North. There's Governor Seymour from New York, I believe, Governor Curtin from Pennsylvania, Governor Dennison from Ohio, Lieutenant Governor Anderson, who was the commander at Fort Sumter 4 years earlier. So there were a lot of important people there. Some of my cabinet members were there. And I looked out on those 15,000 people and I spoke these words on that day, November the 19th, 1863. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, no longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. And I finished, and that's all I had. And the people in the audience thought, well, is that all he has? You know, they thinking the other man spoke for 2 hours, and that's all I had. And finally they realized that's all I had. Those are my few appropriate words. And then they began to give me a little bit of applause appropriate for a president. So that was the Gettysburg Address, and as I said, the war would continue almost another 2 years after that. And we would bring our country back together and end the war about April the 9th, 1865, when Lee surrendered to Grant. And that's it. Any questions? Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You talked about the two 13th amendments.
Yes.
Did the South ever try to make their own constitution, or
Oh,
or did they just go? They just added to the original.
Well, they took the original and they changed some words in it. They took the original, they changed some things like I think they were going to have 6 years for the presidential term. Of course, slavery could not be abolished. States had more rights than they had in the North. They made some changes in it, but basically they took some of the ideas from the original one and just tailored it to their fit, their desires, and their ideas. So It wasn't something that just came up brand new. They changed the original one to the way it would fit their ideas and philosophy. All right, any other questions?
Could you tell them real quickly who your two vice presidents were when you were president of the United States?
Hamlin and Johnson.
And where were they from?
Hamlin from Maine and Johnson from Tennessee.
Very good.
Okay.
Johnson was when he couldn't go back to Tennessee because they were with the southern side. So he lived in Hamilton, Ohio at a motel there when he became president or vice president, and then eventually moved to Washington, D.C. I have a reproduction banner for Abraham Lincoln. You notice he doesn't have his beard. This is his 1860 election banner that would have been flown around, and his vice president was Hannibal Hamlin. And after the term was getting close to the end of when Mr. Lincoln's first election, Hamlin said, well, he's going to fight the war, and he joined the Coast Guard at the end of his term, and he wound up joining the Coast Guard. So this is a reproduction of the flag they would have used in parades and ceremonies, or if he would have came to the train station or wherever he was at. This is a parade lantern, original 1850s all the way up to the after 1870s parade lantern. This would have been used at night. Whale oil would have been in here. You would have lighted it. You would have marched at night to support whoever you wanted for election. The gentlemen who would go around to try to get people to vote for Abraham Lincoln were called the Wide Wakes. And they would wear these black capes, and they had a single eye on them. And they kind of looked scary, but they were getting people's attention. And they were saying, listen to what he has to say. And they would build actually a log cabin. They would travel around and says, this is a house this man here grew up in and lived in. And but he can become the president of the United States. So if you can start from there and he becomes the president, how much he had to go through. So they would carry these in their campaigns around for the election of 1860 and all the other presidents up to the 1870s. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Mr. President,
All right,
for
thank
coming.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Next week, we'll be talking about the beginning of the war, Fort Sumner, all the way through 1862 to the Battle of Antietam.